Let's get started. So today's speaker is Randy Reppen, and she will be talking about effective grammar instruction for writing. And Randy is the Professor of Applied Linguistics at TESL at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona in the US. So I think that's all from me. So I'd like to now hand over to Randy.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully, and we'll be able to start. Can you see the screen okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
That's fine.
Okay, perfect. So as Simon mentioned, I'm very happy to be here and very excited to see all the different countries represented. And I will be talking today about effective grammar instruction for writing. And this is a little screenshot of my university and where I work. So grammar, it's a word that has a real strong reaction from most people, but I think it's really important for us to remember that accurate grammar use is important for success, both academically and socially. And I think this little icon of people running around in gear cogs is sometimes how we feel with grammar. We might be going in different directions. How do we do this? Do we emphasize lots of rules? Do we give just a communicative approach? How are we going to get our students where they need to be? So this also, grammar, I think, is an area where it really highlights the difference between knowledge and ability, because we see this so often when we have a discrete skills curriculum and we're teaching our students grammar, and then they go into the writing class or the reading class or listening and speaking, and they can't apply that grammar. So this is one of the themes that you'll see throughout my presentation of how can we break down and go from knowledge to ability. And nothing like a good Leonardo da Vinci quote, knowing is not enough, we must apply. This is a good thing for us to remember in our grammar classes and in all of our language learning classes. And being willing is not enough, we must do. We have to get our students to use language, to do the language we're teaching, whatever language that is. So how are we going to get there? Well, my goal for today is to talk about 12 principles for grammar instruction that will help us be more effective teachers of writing for academic purposes. And these 12 principles, we're going to look at them sort of in three parts. The first part, we're going to talk sort of about the context of grammar, how we use grammar in different purposes and for different resources. And we're going to talk about differences between speaking and writing, because I think that's something we're often, it's tricky because we write differently from how we speak in an informal context. And then the second part, we're going to look at a lot of different examples, and you'll see throughout, I'm always giving you activities that highlight what point I'm trying to make of one of these principles. And so we're going to look at lots of different approaches to ways to teaching, ways to teach rather, and ways to provide meaningful practice for our students. And then we'll wrap up looking at just some of the 4 skills and using internet and technology. So here we go. So the first principle is to identify the grammar resources that students need. Now that might sound like a no-brainer, but it is something that we often forget to do. Sometimes we have a curriculum or a textbook and we're just marching through it and we're not really thinking about what are the actual needs of our students. And by that, I don't mean a list of discrete grammar points that we practice only at a sentence level. Yes, there's time when practicing at a sentence level is very important, or practicing vocabulary is very important, but we can't stay at that level. And even if we are practicing at a sentence level, those sentences can result in a coherent group of sentences. So there's a context and there's some cohesion for that. So let's look at an example of a way to identify the grammar demands of different types of texts. And when I use the word texts, I use it to mean both spoken and written. And so here if we have a text that's going to be an informational report, a writing like that, a written paper, as we so often ask our students to do, we also could have students thinking about conversations between friends. And so here the purposes are very different. So when we think about identifying the grammar structures and the resources that our students need, we need to think about the purpose. The purpose of having a conversation with your friends is to share information and experiences, but it's personal information. When they write a paper, they're giving factual information. So the text structures of these two interactions are very different. With the informational report, there's descriptions, there's explanations, there's statements of fact. So we're going to have present tense being used. We're going to use grammatical features to package information. We're going to talk about clausal embedding. We're going to have noun-noun sequences. We're going to be focusing on processes versus people. And of course, we need the necessary vocabulary, and we will likely use the past tense, the passive voice, I'm sorry. And with a spoken conversation, we're sharing time and space. So we're going to have a lot more pronouns, questions, responses, fillers, past tense markers. So this is the type of activity that you can do as a teacher to kind of figure out what are the needs, what do my students need to be able to accomplish the tasks that I'm going to give them, and how do I build to get there? You know, you're not going to do all of this at once. So in keeping with that, it's an awareness of the nature of the texts. What are the types of texts that we're going to be doing? And so going back to written and spoken, and the reason I'm doing this at the beginning is because there is such a difference between formal writing and informal spoken language. And so we can take something like a news event on the same topic and compare how they're organized and look at the difference grammar that is in these two different texts, a spoken text. And of course, you'll be looking at a transcript in this case, but even just listening to it and then reading a written text, reading a news report, you'll see differences. You can have students listen to interactions. You know, this is a great way to have students go and listen to different, you know, kind of eavesdrop in a positive way among friends or with a teacher and see how features of grammar, such as modals and pronouns, questions, pauses, how all of these things work together to create the, in a sense, the flavor of that spoken interaction. With more advanced students, you can give them a couple examples, maybe 2 or 3 examples of short research articles and have them analyze how the text is put together in the different sections. So, you know, in a research paper, you have an introduction, you have methods, you have results, and students could focus on questions like, how does that section of text begin? Where is the main idea or the research statement introduced? What verbs and tenses are typical of certain sections? We know that in the methods section of a research paper, we get a lot of passive voice because, again, we're focusing on the process. But then in the results, we're not getting a lot of passives. We're getting a lot of statements of facts, a lot of present tense. And so students can then see how you take these texts apart, and this can be useful for them. Let's say that they go to a different discipline, or because so many times in our English courses, we're teaching English at sort of a general level. And we'll be looking at some resources in the second part of this presentation that will help us be able to look specifically at some of the resources we need for different disciplines. So developing an awareness of differences between speaking and writing. So building on that first activity from the previous slide, you could actually have students compare, you know, specifically how, you know, looking for pronoun use or looking for clausal versus phrasal structures, or even vocabulary. You know, the news report that's spoken, even on the same topic, is going to have a different vocabulary. It's not going to have as many technical words. It's not going to have as many sequences of nouns, and might have about the same number of pronouns, depends on the type of news that you're comparing. You can also have students do this task, which I think is very useful, to take a conversation and turn it into a written script, to take maybe a conversation with a friend about a trip they took and turn that into a blog and then talk about the changes. And one of the themes you'll see throughout this presentation is the notion of talking about language choices, having our students articulate why they did what they did. And it'll come up when we start talking about student errors too. So those of you who know me know that corpora and using corpora to inform language instruction is one of my favorite topics. And so we're going to look at two corpora here. We're going to look at the Michigan Corpus of Upper Level Student Papers, and you can see that's an acronym, MyCUSP. And it's a free online resource that has 829 papers from 16 different disciplines that were written at the University of Michigan. And the thing that's very nice about this as a resource is that it allows students to look at student writing. So these papers were written by students. They weren't written by academics. They weren't written by people who have, many years of experience with academic writing, which is often the model that we put in front of our students, which is a pretty high level model and a mountain to climb. So, if we think about Krashen's I+1, giving a student, even a very advanced student, a lot of research papers and never looking at the student writing that their peers are doing, that's sort of an I+27. So we want to see how we can use these corpora to maybe help us bridge some of that gap. The other corpus that we're going to look at is word and phrase. And so probably several of you have looked at COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, which is a resource that Mark Davies has built. So we're going to look at these two corpora and spend a little bit of time just seeing how we can use them in the classroom and also use them for ourselves as teachers for resources to inform our instruction. So I'm giving you the websites here, but as Simon mentioned, this is being recorded and you can look at the recording. So I'd appreciate it if you don't go to these websites now during the presentation, so that you can see how we can use these. And then you later on, maybe tonight, whatever time is night where you are, you might look at some of these in the evening. So we're going to do three things with the MyCUSP corpus. We're going to look at types of writing tasks that are typical in an academic context. We're going to look at types of writing across different disciplines. And then we're going to look at some of the text features that are typical of academic papers. So here we go. Maybe you haven't had a lot of experience teaching writing, and you're curious about the types of writing that your students might be expected to do in an academic English class. And so this is all of these little bars here that have the little triangle arrow pointing. All of those are drop-down menus, and this site is very friendly to use. So I encourage you to go play with it at some point. And you can see that it has the titles of the papers here. You can look at the entire paper over here if you click on any of these. But the point here is to look at the types of academic writing. So these are typical tasks that students are asked to do: argumentative essay, proposal, report, research paper, critique, evaluation. So a lot of these types of writing are not represented in many of our textbooks that we use. So it's important for us to realize that sometimes we're going to have to maybe go beyond. It depends on the textbooks that you're using. But this is a nice inventory of the types of writing that students will be expected to do in various academic disciplines. So one of the tasks, one of the courses that I've taught that's one of my favorites is a multidiscipline course for graduate students who are new to American University and new to English medium universities. And so I have students from many different disciplines. And so a couple of years ago, I was teaching one of these courses, and I had a student in mechanical engineering. I had a student in forestry. I had a student in humanities, in English. I had one in history. And I didn't know a lot about the types of writing done in history or in mechanical engineering. So I want to show you how, with, again, using a different drop-down menu, looking at the disciplines, I clicked on mechanical engineering and I could look here and I could see that in mechanical engineering, at least in this sample from University of Michigan, almost 60% of the type of writing the students did were research papers, 9% was proposals, and 31% were reports. So for me as a teacher, I know to prepare this graduate student for the types of tasks he's going to meet, I have to make sure he knows how or she knows how to write a research paper. This is really, really an important type of writing for this student to control. So now let's look at history. So I've unchecked mechanical engineering and I've checked history here. And I can see here that they write reports 50% of the time. So that's good. I know that both of my students are going to need experience with report writing, but the history student is not writing any research papers. They are writing response papers, they're writing critiques, and it's almost 50-50 with argumentative essays and report writing. So I, as a teacher, need to be able to teach my students how to be, in a sense, language detectives and can decode the type of writing, give them the tools to figure out, kind of do the text analysis that we looked at the very beginning of this presentation, where they look at the text and try to determine what are the resources, what are the language resources being used to accomplish these different writing tasks? What are verbs that are typical of this? How is information organized? So we can do this by having students use models from their discipline and teaching them how to unpack that and then giving feedback on that. So if you're teaching at a very advanced level, this site is a really useful resource. If you're teaching at maybe a low intermediate or intermediate level, this site can be really useful to give examples of the types of papers that students will be producing, and maybe not this specifically, decoding the different explicit tasks of these papers, but they can look at paper examples very easily. So then the other thing that we know with academic writing is that there's always a structure to these types of writing tasks, whether it's a report or a critique evaluation or a response paper. And we're going to have these types of textual features in these papers. So we can actually say, I want to look just at abstracts. I want to see how people write abstracts, regardless of the discipline. Or you could pick the discipline and the text feature. Looking at how definitions are done. If you click that one, if you clicked definitions, you would see how definitions are structured. You would see how people talk about tables and graphs and figures that are often included in research reports. You can see how this one, reference to sources, that's something that we do in academic papers in almost any type of academic writing. And so we can see how this is done in these example papers. So I hope that you can see how this can be a real resource for you as a teacher, especially, but also for your advanced or high intermediate students. So now we're going to take a quick look at word and phrase. And I think of this as a vocabulary toolkit, and I hope that the example that I show you will highlight that. And I'm going to show you two examples from this website. And you'll see here that I've highlighted use the old version. And I'll walk you through this here. So this is what it looks like if you were to put in if you just type in wordandphrase.info, which you're not doing now, you're not doing that yet, you'll see a page like this. But I want you to, it's very hidden here. When you go to this site, it says use old site. The red box is something I put there because the words are so diminished. And you can see it's a subset of the corpus of COCA, the corpus of contemporary American English. And it's really important. I think the old site, not just because I'm more familiar with it, but the old site is more user-friendly. So I really encourage you to try that site. The new interface has some advantages, but I think for using it with students, this is much easier. So if you were to go to this site, you would always see this type of an interface. And if you're using it with your students, you'll see this frequency list that's just a bunch of words with their part of speech code, which I would say always be careful there because, for example, the word smoke could be a verb, it could be a noun, depending on its context of use. And because this corpus is so large, it hasn't been checked for accuracy. So always, this can also be a nice little grammar activity. But if you do this with your students in a class, and I do this with mine, obviously, and this will look different sometimes. It'll be different words. So tell students, don't worry. But the idea here is that we can analyze our own text. We can put our own writing into this. So if we click on input and analyze texts, we're going to see this come up, and you'll see that there's a white box here. So we can copy and paste a text. Or there are also some sample texts. If you wanted to look, you could see some examples. You can pick different levels of learner texts. And when we do that and click again, we're going to see the text that I put in here. I just put in a short text. It's just 90 words, the beginning of a paper. And on the right-hand side, we see my text, and we see the word distribution here across these frequency bands. I frankly don't think this is very useful because if you look at them very quickly, you'll see that the first band tells you the first 500 most frequent words. The second is from 501 to 3000, and then 3000 and on. So it's not very useful in that sense. And then academic words are just listed in red. And as you can see here, there are no academic words. And supposedly there are no academic words, no specialized words in this section. So if we click on a word in this text, and in this case, I've clicked on the word resources, we can then see down here, we can see these different contexts of use or registers or genres. Well, we can see that we have spoken, fiction, magazines, newspaper, and academic. And we see that resources is a word that is much more frequently used in academic writing. We can see that it's not used that often in fiction, which kind of makes sense, right? But this is the part that I see so useful with this site because I think of this as my vocabulary toolkit right here. This is going to tell me the collocates, and that's just a fancy word to say co-location, words that go together. In my house, words that go together are peanut butter and jelly. We don't say jelly and peanut butter, we say peanut butter and jelly. And so here, this is going to be a little vocabulary toolkit that tells us adjectives that frequently occur with the word resources, nouns that are frequently occurring with that word, and verbs that frequently occur. And so by looking at this, we can kind of get a fine tune. We also see the definition, but we can fine tune this, and we can see that adjectives are human resources, available resources, economic resources, valuable resources, nouns that go together. We can have resource management, resource center, resource department, energy resources. In this case, we're seeing noun-noun sequences, and sometimes our target noun resources comes before or after a different noun. When we look at the verbs that co-occur or the collocates of resource in verbs, we see provide. So we provide resources, we allocate resources, we devote resources, we protect resources. So we can see here, we get a finer sense of the word resources. It's something very positive. It's something we value. Now, this is not to say these are the only words you can use with these, but these are words that if you're reading texts, if you're listening to academic lectures, these are words you're going to see happening with this word. So it's a really useful way to be exposed to highly frequent vocabulary with certain words. So I hope you can see how this can be a really useful resource for students, also for teachers. And now I want to focus on how, in addition to fine-tuning language use, we can, as teachers, if you're teaching a writing class, we all know giving feedback is really time-consuming. And so We can use this to give writing feedback more easily, less time consuming once we've taught our students how to use this site. And then we can also use it to encourage student autonomy because students can go in and check. So when I do this, I teach my students how to use this site and look at the collocations. And then after I've done that, when I'm reading their papers and I notice something that it's not that it's incorrect, it just could be more precise. And so an example of that is a student had written a paper and the topic was natural disasters. So it was things like, horrible things like flooding and tornadoes and fires and hurricanes. And they had said that these cause big damage. Now I understood what they meant. There was nothing grammatically incorrect or conceptually incorrect, but to be more precise, I wanted my student to understand that they could choose different words. So in this case, I use highlighters, and any word in a paper that I highlight with green, my students know to go in and look at that. So in this case, I didn't highlight big because big would not have been able to help my student be more precise. But I wanted my student to look at the adjectives that went together with damage. And so when they go to the site, they see the word damage highlighted, they think, oh, Dr. Randy wants me to look at adjectives or what could come before damage that would be more precise. So when we look at this, we see serious damage, severe damage, significant damage, structural damage, permanent damage. So we see a lot of words that we can choose from. And this doesn't mean any one of these words could work. The student still has to be actively engaged, but it can help our students when we're not there with them and they're passed on to, outside of our English programs. And they're thinking, well, what are words that go with this? What are some other resources that I can use to express myself more clearly or more precisely? This is exactly where I want my students to go. And it also helps me not spend so much time writing notes. I just use my green highlighter. So another thing that we have to remember is that we have to use a variety of teaching approaches. So we want to make sure that we know that our learners have different styles, and we want to make sure that we're accommodating as many of the different learning preferences. So we have some students who they want the rules, they want to see explicit examples. We have other students who tolerate ambiguity. They're happy looking at patterns and figuring it out. So we want to have examples and activities that incorporate both of these. So we need multiple exposure with any kind of grammar, or any kind of language learning, vocabulary, listening, speaking, all of that, but we're focusing on academic writing. So this notion is we have to give engaging, meaningful practice that addresses these different learning styles, and it's practiced within the context of use. It's not just forced into an artificial context. So I want to give two examples here of, we use charts when we teach grammar. And whether you're teaching lower level writing or advanced writing, we still have charts. So I want to give you two examples that can be used with different levels of students. And one is what I call become the expert. And in this case, we take the grammar chart in the book that you're using and you cut the chart up, and I'll show you an example of this. And as this is if you're teaching in person, which some of us might be doing now. You cut the chart up, and as a student comes in, you hand them a piece of the chart. And then when the class begins, the students have to interact and find each other. So now those students are the experts. So here's an example with plural nouns. I've copied that part of the chart. I cut it up, and first student comes in, I give them this. The second student comes in, or the third, I mix them up. And then those students have to match each other. So they're talking about the rule and the example, putting them together. And then they're the experts. And of course, with plural nouns, this is a pretty easy example, but we can do this with more complex structures too. The other way we can do this with a more advanced class is, instead of, if you're reviewing, or if this is something that you have more advanced students, give students the rule side of the chart, or have them just cover up the examples in their book. And then have students look for those examples of the rules in their readings or textbooks, or even in their own writing. And this will help them reinforce that grammar is not an isolated skill. It helps transfer grammar out of the silo of the grammar classroom and helps students see how it is used in my textbook. It is used in my reading. It is used in my writing. So also, I know I'm going fast, but I want to be able to give you lots of different ideas to think about and also to cover different levels. So this notion of noticing, we know that noticing precedes learning. You have to notice something before you can learn it. And so we use a lot of techniques in textbooks, and as teachers, we use font enhancement. We put things in color, we put things in bold, and that's great. But if we don't do something with this, if we don't do something with what I call guided noticing or discovery noticing, we often don't know if the learner made the right inferences from looking at those font enhanced texts. So I want to point out how noticing can take place in the classroom. So I'm going to give you an example from a textbook, and then an activity where noticing can take place outside of the classroom. So here's a text, and we can see that there are certain words like information and work that are in bold, money, damage. So we could stop right there, hope that students, notice these words, but what are we going to do with these words? Well, if we have an activity where they go in and they find the sentences with an article and complete them, look at the sentences below rather, and find them in the article and see, so the student isn't responsible for deciding whether an article goes there, they're finding it, they're putting either an X or the article, but then they're given a question at the end, which of the nouns are things you can count, which are ones you can't count, which noun is plural. And so in this case, it's helping students realize, oh, when am I going to use an article? If it's a non-count noun, I'm not going to use an article in front of it. So that's taking noticing one step further. This is obviously happening inside a classroom. We can also do this outside a classroom with a target form that we're teaching. So in this case, maybe we're working on the passive, and we have students have maybe 2 days, and they record, they have a little notebook and they have their little chart here with agentless passive. So, the milk was spilled. The passive with an agent, the milk was spilled by the small boy. And then we have the get passive of, he got sick. And so we could then see whether we heard it, we read it, we said it, or we wrote it. And so students are just doing this, all the different students are doing that. And then they come back to the class with their little charts. And the next, depending if your class is every day, maybe do it over a 2-day period, and then talk about the patterns. And we'll notice here in this example that agentless passive happens in almost everything, but get passive pretty much happens only in spoken. Maybe the student said it, maybe they heard it more, but it's not happening very often with reading or writing. So this is a nice way to notice things actively, and also, again, to take the grammar outside the silo of the grammar classroom. We also, you might be thinking, okay, Randy, we've been saying all these ways of doing things, but what about, we have different levels of learners. We have some structures that are really easy to catch and others that are more difficult. And not only to know how to produce it, but when to use it. So I think it's helpful for me as a teacher to think about the different levels of practice. So we have mechanical practice, meaningful practice, and communicative practice. So with mechanical practice, it's where we're doing drills, it's substitution activities. But again, these can be at a sentence level or maybe at a paragraph level, but it could be at a sentence level where the focus is on the form, but yet the sentences are somehow related to each other. It's not just wild sentences on different topics. We can have meaningful practice where we've moved from not just a focus on the form, but also on the meaning. And so students are maybe given a bit of a controlled task where they make meaningful choices. So an example would be a model letter with certain features highlighted, and then the students write a letter. And then we have the last one, which is a communicative practice where it's a real communicative context. So we've moved through, we've stepped through, we've scaffolded our learning. And this might not be like one day, next day, next day. It might be, depending on the student's level, more time with mechanical practice, or If they're more advanced, it might be moving, from meaningful to communicative. But in this case, the language is not totally predictable. So they've had the controlled practice in the meaningful thing, but now they're writing a letter on their own, maybe to future students with tips for success based on their experiences. So the language is not totally predictable. It's not following a model precisely. And it's a real communicative context, and real information is being exchanged. So along that same line, that's kind of expanding on that, it's the notion of providing opportunities for what's called stretched output that causes, that requires tasks where learners have to expand what they know about a particular structure. They're restructuring it. They're seeing how that same verb can be used in a different context and be used to, prepositions are a great example because, we often teach them in a very concrete way, but then we use them very often in more metaphorical ways. So we can see like an example of, the ball is in the closet, but then we have the same preposition in when we talk about an increase in oil prices. So I think this is, an example at a pretty low level of stretched output. And along that same line, the idea of making links, overt links about the intimate relationship between vocabulary and grammar, and teaching language in chunks. We know that there's certain chunks of language that we use regularly, and we want to make sure that our learners, we teach them as chunks. So there are some very frequent adjectives and their prepositions that go with those adjectives. So if I were to say, I'll give you an example. I'm going to say, I was aware, you would fill out that preposition. And I bet most of you in your head said, I was aware of this online conference that Cambridge is hosting. You might not finish the sentence the same way, but. So let's look at how we can do that. Here's a list of really common adjectives that are used with prepositions. So we have similar to, interested in, responsible for. So teaching these as chunks of language. And I know that my students have trouble with prepositions. Prepositions in English are a mess. So this can be a really nice chunk of language to help students and give them more confidence in their language use. At the beginning, I talked a little bit about using student errors for informing instruction, and not in the sense of errors as, we want our students to make errors. That's going to sound funny coming from a teacher. But if our students aren't making any errors, there's two things that could be going on. One is they're in the wrong level. They're not having to push themselves. They're not having encounters with communicative, purposeful, meaningful language. Because if you're a learner, even a fluent user is going to have some disfluencies or errors, or maybe they're afraid of you as a teacher. But I can't imagine anybody being afraid of you guys because you're probably all really nice. So I'm going to give you two examples of looking at errors to inform instruction. So one, we're going to use the student errors as a source of instruction. But again, then we're going to have a second type where we take our students outside the classroom again. And if you're teaching online, you can still do this by having them look on the internet. So student errors, you've read their papers and you realize, my students are having trouble with this use of not, inflecting the verb after a modal. So we have right here, yesterday I could finished all my homework, Tom is study. So when you come into the classroom early, you have these two sentences written on the board. The students come in, they write them, and they fix the error. And you make sure everybody fixes the error correctly. So this is students who are probably at a lower level, struggling with verb tenses. So they come in, find the error, fix the error. And you can keep a little journal of this. And you choose these errors based on what you've seen in either their writing or in journals that they're writing. But having students engaged in outside the classroom, so you can have students looking for errors. And now with these digital phone, with these smartphones, we can have students take pictures. I used to have students copy them down, but we could see that this is tips. It's, often in a restaurant or a cafe, you'll see a jar and it'll have the apostrophe S. It'll say tips, or the door is broke. Not a good thing. So then students would then bring that in and they would correct it. So this is, again, having students realize that if you're in an English language environment, that even, things written by supposed native speakers are making errors. So we're wrapping up here. And even though we're focusing on academic writing, it's really important for grammar to be taught and practiced across all skills. We can't just focus on, writing. We have to talk about our writing. We brainstorm, we give feedback, we do peer editing. And we always want to present moving from part to whole, kind of that mechanical, meaningful, communicative structure. We could have students doing activities where they listen and try to guess the context. So they could hear a conversation and think, how the conversation took place? Was it on the phone or face to face? Who was interacting? Were there good friends? Was it a worker calling his supervisor? What was the goal of the conversation? And then talking about those decisions. How did you know what that was? And then having students role play requests and trying to figure out what the relationships were. And this is really, really useful for practicing modals. So things like, can I bother, can you give me a ride versus, is there any chance that you could give me a ride to school today? Depending on who you're asking and the relationship. And then, using the internet and technology resources, we have so many things available to us now that even, 15 years ago, we didn't have. So we can use technology to provide a real audience for students writing tasks or speaking tasks. We can have them write book reviews and post them. We can have students write news reports, and you could create a paper for your English program where advanced students and lower level students work together to write articles and distribute maybe to other classes. You can provide additional writing and listening practice with technology. You can have students listening to a news broadcast and then turning that into an academic writing paper. We can have using Corpora, of course, my favorite activity. So I showed you 2 examples. There are many others that you can use to help create learner autonomy and also to make your role as a teacher more effective and efficient by, the example of the green highlighters. So to wrap up, it's really important that grammar works together with vocabulary, and all these different resources reflect the context of use. We can't divorce writing from the context and purpose of the writing task. An argumentative paper is going to be different from a narrative, from a critique evaluation. That you need to, as teachers, I think the most effective thing we can do to be successful with academic writing is to develop a learner's awareness of the nature of text and help them learn how to, in a sense, be a language detective, an analyst, and look at the grammar resources and the vocabulary being used in a text and engage in different types of activities. And the 12 principles I gave you were just ways and ideas that hopefully show you how you don't have to have grammar just in the classroom, decontextualized practice. We want always to have it be meaningful and that we see it as an essential communicative resource, whether it's to interact with friends in a spoken conversation, or whether it's to write a short blog for your website, or whether it's to write a paper in mechanical engineering or history or forestry, whatever discipline, that you can be successful in that. So going back to Leonardo da Vinci, knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. And we as grammar teachers have to create that environment. So thank you very much for listening to this really fast presentation. And I hope that you don't feel like this little guy here. And I am happy to answer questions. And here are some resources that might be helpful.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Randy, just looking at some of the questions coming in. If you do have a further question for Randy, anything you'd like to ask based on the talk, then please put them in the Q&A box and I'll see how many I can get through. So I'll start with one here from John. It says, I'd like to know if there is information from subject teachers in the US and UK universities about what they think are the weak points in the writing of students with English as a second language. And he says further to this, my comment, it often seems to me like the language teachers are working on this problem from their language learning perspectives rather than the perspectives of the specialists, the subject teachers.
I think that's a really, really important question. And I think that as language teachers, most of the language, I'd get to do a lot of workshops and do a lot of teacher training. And a lot of the teachers, when I ask them what their background is, they all studied English. And so they come at writing tasks from the perspective of the humanities, which is really, really different from the perspective of the sciences. So my background, actually, I was a geologist. My undergraduate is in geology, and I worked as a geologist. And later in my life, I went in to get a teaching certificate, and the types of writing that I saw being taught as ways to teach writing, I thought, that's not how I wrote as a scientist. And so it's really important. And this is why the resource of MyCusp, the Michigan Corpus of Upper Level Student Papers, is such a tremendous resource, because that is what we see happening many times in our classrooms. So if you think about a typical English language teaching book, it often will focus on narrative tasks, and those are personal narrative tasks, and that's very different from the type of writing you're going to do in the disciplines that most of our students represent, which I think that, at least in the US, engineering, natural sciences, and business are three very common majors for our students and the students we're teaching. And the types of writing in there are very different from just personal narratives or argumentative papers that are sort of a position piece. And so it's really important for us to be aware of the types of writing tasks, and maybe having our students go, if they're advanced or if not advanced, us as the instructor going and looking at the syllabi and the writing tasks in those courses. So I think a lot of the times, to specifically answer your question, the weakness that many US or English language medium professors see is a mismatch between the students don't have experience with the writing tasks. And that's that's textbooks. It's, I think we're moving away from that. More and more textbooks are corpus informed. There are a lot of ESP books out there that are helpful, so we can start to bridge that. But it's the idea of language use, and also the specificity, the type of language being used, the vocabulary, the use of phrasal structures versus just clausal. Does that answer your question, John? Simon, is John happy? You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I can't see. There's lots of comments coming through, so
okay.
I hope he is. Thanks for the answer. Let's move on to a question from Peter, which is, any advice for giving feedback / correction to students who lack grammatical meta language? The sort of nuts and bolts of.
Yeah. I would say that a lot of native English speakers lack the grammatical meta language also. But I would say, first of all, giving feedback, identify a pattern. Don't try to address everything, because that's overwhelming. So you want to identify what's going to help that student be more successful in the next draft, or be more successful as they move forward with their writing. So it might be focusing on vocabulary. And I think teaching the meta language is also important. So making sure that students can talk about the language choices they're making. And it doesn't mean that we have to say passive voice. It could mean talking about, there is no person here doing this action, the solution, let's see, the solution was poured into the bowl, or the soup was poured into the bowl, to get it out of a science context. The soup was poured into the bowl. You could ask, do we know who poured that soup into the bowl? No. So there is no doer here. We could call it a do, we could call that person a doer instead of calling them an agent, and then work up to that. So I think teaching the meta language, we have to have the language to talk about language, but it doesn't have to all be complicated. We could say, you know, he went to the store, he is at the store. What's the difference there? And talk about the meaning and how that verb changed the meaning. You know, both are talking about someone who's at the store, but they were at the store before or they are at the store now. So just talking about that is what I would do. And picking patterns of errors, patterns versus rules is really important, I think.
This is another good question here from Dr. Farouk. It says, don't you think that instead of putting limitations on students through strict grammar rules, we need to promote free writing? At least, you know, what do you think about that sort of, without this sort of grammatical structure to start off with, or should it be there from the outset?
No, I think that, I mean, if you're teaching beginners and students who don't have many linguistic resources, just getting them to write words on a page is huge. And that means that somehow they're controlling the script, they know the orthography, they're able to put letters together in a meaningful way. So yeah, but as we move forward, we have to, you know, doing free writing, I believe in free writing. I do free write at the beginning of each class. I'll sometimes bring a picture or a student brings something and they write, but they only write for a minute or 2 minutes. And we see how many words they can put there and we don't worry about the grammar. But then as we move from sort of low beginner to middle beginner, then we do some things. We might take those words that they put and think, can you write some sentences with them? And so I think free writing is important because writing is hard. Even for those of us who've been doing it for a long time, it's really hard to get started. So I think free writing is a good resource to just get us used to getting words on the page. But then I think we do have to talk about grammar and put it in a context. Just,
well,
you know,
thank you. Yeah, there's a few questions around the sort of basics of how can somebody teaching English know about all these different kind of disciplines? How do you manage that? You know, you've got an engineering student, you've got a scientist, you've got a, I don't know, geographer or something. So how would you get information from the students themselves, or is there an enormous amount of research you have to do beforehand? I know you were quoting those the Michigan Corpus, you know, the cross-discipline site where you could find some of that out. But
some information.
Yeah, how would you go about that?
So what I've done is I directed our English language program for a long time, and what we did was, as students became more advanced, we had them go interview professors in the discipline they wanted to be in. So, you know, mechanical engineering, he would go talk to a mechanical engineer. If they wanted to be an anthropologist, they would go talk to an anthropology professor. I would also, when I had a class of students who had different interests, one year I had a lot of students who were interested in hotel restaurant management as a major. And then I had some that were interested in business, and then some that were interested in biology. I had a panel of professors come to the class and just talk to them, you know, and the students could ask questions about what kinds of things did the students have to do? How much did they have to read to be successful in that class? Also, you know, at a general level, many times as we move into advanced English language instruction, we still stay at that level of personal narrative. And we have to move past that. And so we might not know specifically about what does a microbiologist do, but we know in natural sciences, there's a lot of research out there on academic writing in different disciplines. The Journal of Second Language Writing is a great resource. The Journal of English for Academic Purposes is a great resource for us as teachers. And I know you're thinking, oh my goodness, I have enough to do. I don't need to be going and turning into a junior researcher. But we can know general patterns. And there are also really good books that are out there. You know, some of these resources that I've put here are helpful if you get excited about corpus linguistics, but also we know that in sciences, there's a real focus on technical language. So making sure your students can get the vocabulary, and maybe that's having students work on textbooks that are from their discipline, an introductory textbook, something as in a sense simple as that. But looking at the syllabi, we do that. Content-based instruction can be really useful. Having a module or a course that is focused on introductory level content using content specific information and not doing that for the whole semester or quarter, but maybe you do 2 weeks of hotel restaurant management, 2 weeks of anthropology. And that way you're having your students also be aware of how texts differ across different disciplines.
You said something about the introductory level there. There's a question here saying I have a lot of A1 adult students who need accuracy in written English. However, their English level is not great, let's just say. Is it better to build their English foundation first, or is it acceptable to go into business English? Obviously, that's the discipline, which is mostly sort of an A2 and above level. So this is
I think
basic.
Yeah. So I think that if you know your students are going to do business and that's their sole focus, I think teaching general vocabulary, you're going to have to build that foundation. I mean, we can't do language without words. And so, a lot of vocabulary, but contextualized vocabulary, and teaching chunks again. I think teaching chunks of language, lexical bundles, clusters, n-grams, whatever you want to call them, is such a tremendous and underused resource in many of our language programs. And so I think focusing with business, but realize if they're doing business in English, they're also going to have to probably go to a grocery store. So you want them to be able to go and have some of that sort of more interpersonal knowledge. So I would say, yeah, build as much vocabulary and teach chunks of language and then build from there. So I'd focus on business if we know their business, if that's their primary focus.
We might just have time for one more, which is from Paola. Sometimes I spend a lot of time studying the structure and the rules about grammar, but then a week later, I forget it. What can I do?
Yeah, so that exactly is the whole theme of the presentation. You've captured it in a nutshell. It's the idea of it can't just be rule-based. You want to see how those rules are used. It's sort of like if you think about them as an example, analogous to driving. You might know all the rules of driving, but if you don't know how to start the car and go down the road, it doesn't matter that you have to stop at the stop sign. You have to, you have to be able to do it. You have to be able to use it. So we go back to Leonardo. Knowing is not enough. We can't just know about grammar. We have to apply it. And we can't just think about applying it. We have to do it. And we're going to make mistakes, and it's scary. So I think, instead of just studying rules, look at examples, try to find, pick a rule and look for examples in different places. And I think that'll really help you get that rule in your head. So
Fantastic.
good questions.
Great.